see California as an alternative to what's being proposed by Perry in Texas? And if so, how? And if not, why not?
You have to look at the internal dynamics of these states. Texas is finished. Texas is going to become a Mexican-American liberal state in the next decade. That's why Perry is kind of leaving, looking for other platforms. California has already had its Texas moment. That was 20 years ago. We've gone through everything, every form of madness known to current politics. We had our taxpayer revolt against property taxes, Prop 13. We had Pete Wilson running commercials saying the immigrants were running over the border and going to invade us. We took repressive measures. We led in mass incarceration of young blacks and Latinos until we couldn't afford it anymore. We tried the strongman approach. We threw out Gray Davis and put in Arnold Schwarzenegger and discovered that he couldn't deliver either. So we've had it. The fever is broken in California. In addition, California has a future far different than Texas. It's a positive future because we're already implementing immigration reform, clean energy, alternative energy, more funding for schools and colleges, more taxes imposed on the rich in recent years, which positions California, I think, for a long-term effect on the rest of the country. Mm-hmm. The wind is blowing again from California, and the wind is progressive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why isn't anybody articulating that in California, or is there somebody doing that?
Why should they? It doesn't, I don't know. This is all media stuff. I just think those of us who live here and are involved in politics know it's a hard-won result. We don't take it for granted, but it's obvious. If there are flaws in California as a, quote, model, it's only because these dichotomies exist inside of states as well as inside the United States. So there's a very strong tough on crime element. The prison guards are the biggest campaign contributors that you can imagine. They fight tooth and nail against the release of inmates. The business community has adjusted to the fact that the Democrats are taking over, and they've cultivated pro-business Democrats, and the Chamber of Commerce is getting nearly everything they want out of the California legislature. So there's a back and forth within California, but overall, California is on track to be a state with a progressive future, and it's one of about 15 or 20 such states. We've had this before. For example, when I was involved in the early years, the first Brown administration, I was the chairman of the State Solar Energy Council when everybody thought it was lunacy, Governor Moonbeam and all that. And we got off to a good start. And as a result, over 30 years, California's energy policies have affected fuel efficiency in automobiles, fuel efficiency in appliances, wind energy, solar energy. Nobody's laughing anymore. They're all looking to California. California has now created a pact with British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, around clean energy, a sharing of resources. That's 73 million people right there. Just as California created a pact in the 70s with, I believe it was a dozen or so northeastern states on fuel efficiency standards, which were eventually to have an impact on cars coming out of Detroit, and all the federal standards on energy came originally from California, I believe. So you can think of it, I said to Jerry Brown at some point that he should think of himself as Archimedes, the ancient philosopher who was always looking for a leverage point, where if he stood on the leverage point, the world would come his way, the world would change. And I think if you view California as a leverage point, you can see the impact that it will have this year and next year on national politics.
And what about going forward? You mentioned the Energy Pact with Washington, Oregon, and so forth. Are there other areas where you see California way ahead of the curve and doing things that might have an impact, say, 15, 20, 30 years down the road, nationally?
Well, immigrant rights. After trying to exploit the immigrants, deport the immigrants, persecute the immigrants, stop the immigrants from coming here, from voting. Now, we welcome the immigrants, and we have laws now that give in-state tuition to undocumented students. We have laws. The one I like the most is the one that allows undocumented immigrants from Mexico or wherever to become lawyers. So they're participating in a legal system which they're actually violating. Go figure. I think it's perfect. And so while Washington is completely paralyzed on immigration reform, nothing will come on immigration reform out of the nation's capital except a bad bill. California is already implementing immigration reform. And other states are on the way following the California model. That's one obvious example.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What about in an area like tech, for instance, and the synergies between technology and business and sort of clean energy and things like that? Do you see trends there?
Technology, California is the home of Silicon Valley, much coveted industry. Very progressive on social issues. They're terrible on working conditions, wages, the exploitation of cheap labor in China, for example. They've really got to get with the 1930s in terms of their approach to labor. And they poison with chemicals a lot of the environment. So I think the technology revolution is a mixed bag, but they're not like having CIA and Pentagon contractors breathing down your neck in Sacramento. We're relatively clean in terms of the old military lobbies. So the tech industry can be recruited or take the lead on issues of supporting public education, certain environmental reforms, cleaning up, politics, campaign contributions, pretty good on marriage equality, LGBT issues.
We talked about, obviously, these divisions in the country that are kind of gurgling up beneath the surface, but it seems to me that Perry, in his efforts at disseminating his message, is appealing to a pretty substantial base of people who want to see, let's say, less government involvement, more, fewer taxes, less regulation, and so on. All the things that you can find in Texas. All of the things that you talked about in California. Do you think that nationally there is enough energy or impetus to follow California's lead, or is the national trend sort of moving, back toward Perry's model?
I think that your network has made a total mistake in choosing Perry. He's going nowhere. You should have chosen the governor of New Jersey. Then we could have a serious discussion. It seems to me that on a more serious level, beneath the superficialities of everyday punditry and political analysis, there are very deep wounds, fissures in America that are not captured exactly by state lines. They come from the conquest of the country and the killing of so many native people. the wars of the West, the Indian Wars, in which Perry obviously represents the cowboy side, the Civil War, in which the old Confederacy is incarnated anew in the Christian fundamentalists and the Tea Party. These won't go away, and it's a big disservice by journalism and politicians to describe these fissures as red versus blue. It completely obfuscates the nature of our history and the frictions that exist, the quake lines that exist. They don't come by color. They come as a result of the wars, the winners and losers that drew the lines and settled the country. And the same arguments are just below the surface all the time. And we struggle for a modicum of civility. But basically what you're seeing is a repolarization of the United States along the lines of these fissures. There's a permanent block of 20 to 25 states anchored in the Confederacy and in the Wild West. They have fundamentalist views on male superiority, racial superiority. They are against affirmative action. They're against labor unions. They're for drilling to the max and relaxing environmental protections. They're not red. These people are the forces of reaction against historic losses that they perceive themselves as having suffered in the 60s, in the 1930s, in the Civil War, and so on. And on the other side are forces that are misnamed blue, which are more liberal to left or center progressive, who favor a strong public sector, who favor labor protections, environmental protections, equality along gender lines or sexual orientation, public spending on universities and schools, and all that. And so it's a in the short term it's the 60s all over again, described as red and blue. Longer term, it's the 30s all over again, described as red and blue. So it's no wonder that the presidency is very important for narrow purposes, that is, to appoint the Supreme Court, to veto bad laws, to prevent wars before they get out of hand, all extremely important. But the pressure on the presidency for social change or breaking and stopping social change comes from these blocks, from these states.
And you've described this situation as America being on the brink of a civil war. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I suppose the language strikes people as extreme because they imagine a lot of blue coats and gray coats slaughtering each other on battlefields. But if you look at the fact that 50 or 60,000 people per year die in gun violence, while nothing is done about it, and the gun lobby is heavily centered in the regions of the Wild West and the Confederacy, I can rest my case. Is that a civil war? Well, how about closing all abortion clinics in 20 states? Is that a war against women, or is that an exaggeration? Call it what you want, but large numbers of people, a majority of poor children, live in states where the doors are really closed in terms of their access to services that they would have if they moved into another state. And Perry is simply an example of this, but not the only one. It's possible that the politics of reactionary nostalgia will make a successful comeback, and the White House will be occupied by Texas, but I don't think so. Mm-hmm. By then, Texas will have a Mexican governor.
You said to me earlier that the future lies in those areas of the U.S. that are laboratories for real change versus those areas that are bastions of no surrender. So you would obviously place Texas in the latter category.
Well, Texas, of course, is the bastion of no surrender. It's the land of the Alamo. And I wouldn't wish that on any future generation, that they just go down for principles that aren't worth fighting over because they're rejected by a majority of Americans, but that's Texas. The phrase laboratories of reform, I think, comes from former U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. And he was speaking of the progressive era, I suppose, back nearly a century ago. And the idea was where the federal government is limited or bottlenecked, states are the excellent place to experiment with reforms, which, when worked out, will later spread to the rest of the country. An example of such a reform that is currently in trouble is Obamacare. But an example of such a reform that worked were the adoption of energy standards in California in the 1970s, which Detroit said would close the automobile industry. Detroit seemed to want to stay with the idea of 12 miles to the gallon as a competitive sales idea in a world that was turning to Japan or Korea. So I think the another way to think of the states or large cities like New York under de Blasio as laboratories for reform would be, if you look at the New Deal, the original legislation and regulations on sweatshops, on labor standards, on 8-hour day, on recognition of unions, all that came out of Mayor LaGuardia, came out of New York mayors and governors, one of whom was a cautious, pragmatic Franklin D. Roosevelt. When he got to office, the New Deal had already been tested and adjusted in New York, and he swiftly adopted it and brought it to the national level. So that's how it works. You could call it, if you're a political scientist, progressive state-based federalism. It's not states' rights, but it's not an overemphasis on the federal power as being the center of the universe. It's more federalism with the emphasis on states as the experimental laboratories.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You said earlier that in a generation, Texas will be a Mexican-American progressive place. Both California and Texas have large Latino immigrant populations. I'm wondering if you see differences in those populations based on either cultural issues or proximity to Mexico or whatever economic issues that may sort of shape the trajectories of those communities in each place.
Well, obviously, anybody that knows the region knows that Texas and California's Latino populations are different. But the point is that the Tejanos, the Mexicans in Texas themselves predict with confidence that they will become the decisive majority in 2 or 3 election cycles. Will it look like California? No, not exactly, but it won't look like the Alamo. Texas, by the way, has a very feisty, white, quote-unquote, populist tradition also, symbolized by Austin, a literary tradition. I'm not talking about the Mexican takeover that the right wing fears. I'm talking about the gradual demographic shift, which is all but inevitable, which will alter the balance in voting in Texas towards the Obama Democratic coalition.
Mm-hmm. And in California?
California is set for the time being. Jerry Brown has made some very wise moves, I think, prudent moves that people on the left did not agree with, but he's our best at navigating this transition. He said, for example, we have to raise taxes on the rich. Other people said more. He said no more than this level. Other people said permanently. He said no way. He quoted the Bible and said 7 years, and then the tax increases will expire, and we'll see what result came to the state, and the debate can be renewed. So he's making a careful transition from the wicked ways of our past, and we gave this state Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Howard Jarvis. The Prop 13 was the predecessor of the Tea Party. John Birch Society. We had a very volatile conservative to ultra-right politics. Jerry Brown's father was tossed out of the governor's office as a result of that civil war in 1964-66. So Jerry Brown has incorporated all this in terms of the past, the present, the future, and I think we're on a road that's predictably more progressive. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The only reason Democratic presidential candidates will ever come to California again is to steal money for back east, campaign contributions. But we don't depend on them for much more. They're just not here. The states that are in up for grabs, as you say, are less than 20, more like 12. And these are the states where these fissures are so near the surface that anything might happen. But other states have already gone over to one side or another. And when I say we're talking about progressive state-based federalism, I don't mean that I don't care about the Democrats in Texas who will always lose until they win, or the poor children who will be in states where, there's no food stamps, or the women who will never be able to get to an abortion clinic. But I do think of them as behind enemy lines for now. That's why you need Obama, federal regulations, the Justice Department on Voting Rights Act, to do everything they can to protect the equal rights of people behind those enemy lines until the balance changes again. But we're in a situation that I think is certainly grave enough to use terminology like enemy lines. There's no question. I don't know, it may sound harsh to use this terminology, but I guarantee you, as an old hand, this is how they talk behind closed doors.
Mm-hmm. And for
this is combat that's barely civil.
Right.
And often breaks out into violence or threats of violence.
Right. And for people who aren't necessarily familiar with all the intricacies of American politics or all the policy implications of what's happening in California or Texas, how would you, if you were to cast forward, say, 20 or 30 years, are you comfortable making a prediction about the future of America given these realities?
No, you can't really predict the outcome of a battle when you're in the battle. Outcomes are not foreordained. They're not mandated. The outcomes are determined by the competence, courage, and the level of commitment of those who participate. Trends are just that. Trends are there to be seen and used. So you can't tell, but I don't think there's any doubt that what I call the Obama coalition will prevail as the majority of voters in America. And it'll be quite progressive, more progressive than any president. It will be liberals on the left, unions, African Americans, Latinos, immigrants, Asian Americans, women, LGBT, environmentalists. Boom. That's more than 50% and growing. The danger there is divisions getting out of hand. On the other side, you have the old Confederacy and the states that want to rewind the Indian Wars. You have Big Coal, 23 states. And they correctly perceive that they're a shrinking demographic. So instead of adjusting to the new majority, which they find somehow intolerable, they choose to fight. And since they're not a majority, they have to do everything in their power, including unconstitutional behavior, to reduce the voting turnout among the majority. That's why you have all these voter fraud laws and voter rights cases. That's why they overturned the Voting Rights Act. They'll do everything possible to make it hard for a young person, an elderly person, a person of color to exercise the right to vote. And they're quite successful at it, but I don't think that it ultimately works, because as people realize what they're up to, what the game is, it tends to mobilize more young people, more people of color, to fight for the right to vote and to exercise the right to the vote. But you know, you don't really know how it'll be settled.
Some people have talked about what's happening in Texas as a race to the bottom, in the sense that if they do pursue these policies of, you know, extremely cheap labor, low taxes, no regulation, and so on, it starts to resemble a third world scenario very quickly.
The failing, floundering Rick Perry Texas model is indeed a race to the bottom, the lowest possible wages, rolling back environmental restrictions, etc. And that's not a miracle. That's a frightening. The California approach is simply more nuanced. It wouldn't be possible to just wipe away minimum wage laws or labor protections. They're not strong enough in the opinion of many, many people in California. But California has chosen what the pundits call the high road, and Texas is called the low road. This should not be reduced to competing economic strategies, because the choice is, that's not what it's about. One is going nowhere, and the other is going somewhere. Texas is not going anywhere. Texas is going to be taken over by what they fear most, the Reconquista de los Mexicanos, the Mexican takeover that is feared most by Pat Buchanan and the rest of them. And I really don't think that the Mexican immigrants, as they grow in confidence and numbers in Texas, are going to be seeking the lowest possible wages. It's not going to happen.
Now, you've talked about the future of America being rooted much more firmly in the Americas, more broadly, Central America.
Yeah, I fundamentally believe that we have to understand that we're living in the Americas, which is slightly different than the United States of America. The United States of America is part of the Americas. It's an old term that comes from empire times that needs to come back, I suppose. And by that I mean, if you live where I've lived, I'm from Michigan. You know, we don't know much about Mexico, at least not in the years I grew up. Now, if you look at the Tigers lineup, it's a different story. But it's hard when you're dominated by East Coast media and East Coast politics to understand the profound change that is already occurring and that is completely irreversible. You really get it when you live in border country like Los Angeles. What you get is that the the demographic, the population growth of people from Mexico, Central America, and Latin America is growing and is irreversible, and they are becoming a majority in many American cities and will become the decisive population bloc in the United States in the next couple of decades. Currently, they're a regional power on the verge of becoming a national power. And it seems to me, without disrespecting Europe or the Middle East, the attention of our highly educated national security elite has been much more on those regions and not on Latin America. When you ask them why, as I have many times, they simply say they don't think it's important, as if only if Mexico got an atom bomb would they qualify as a national security issue. But you know, the fact of the matter is that we are completely interconnected through migration and commerce with Mexico and Latin America, the southern states, and the Southwest. But it's also true that when you look for somebody to you know, pick your food in Washington State or out in Ohio, again and again you'll find Mexicans. And then people say, what are these Mexicans doing here? Well, it's the nature of our culture and our economy. And then you'll go to the schoolroom in a seemingly white state, you know, like Wisconsin or Ohio, I'm just guessing, and you'll look around and say, where'd all these Mexican kids come from? Why are they the majority of kids in the public schools? Is it any wonder then that people want to defund public schools? Certain people do. Is that going to happen? Maybe, maybe not, but then you'll still have to educate the kids of these migrants. So it's happening, and I think it's the biggest gap in Obama's foreign policy and worldview, because Obama never in his life visited south of the border, as far as I know, until he became president and surrounded by all these guys with funny things in their ears. So he'll never see quite what's happening.
Let's just talk about this. You introduced this term participatory democracy into the American lexicon. The Occupy movement, a lot of it was rooted in Oakland, California.
Well, Occupy was global. It was it was a form of participatory democracy, you know, to the max, with people fully participating in all the decisions of all the assemblies. As to its effects, it's interesting that everyone, all the pundits, without exception, say that Occupy changed the national conversation. Good. I, for one, however, am very tired with talk. It's one thing to change the conversation towards inequality. It's another thing to do something about it and get it done. So I'm more interested in the politics that came out of the Occupy moment. For example, the election of Mayor de Blasio in New York on an actual platform of doing something about inequality between the haves and the have-nots. I think that Occupy was a trigger, a catalyst. It subsided primarily due to its own internal limitations, and I expect it to come again, come back in some other form, as long as the problem continues to fester. Look at the mayor of New York last night. Contrast him to everything you see on Fox News. He gets up. He has an African-American wife who used to identify as a lesbian. He has an African-American daughter who's in a college out here in California. Maybe that's where the influence comes from. And he has now a famous teenage son named Dante with this big afro that even Obama has commented on. Now, that's an image of the American family of the future in some variation or the other. The candidate didn't hide his family. He even sent his son out to turnstiles and shaking hands with people, And viscerally, everybody got the reminder that this is the same country in which Trayvon Martin was killed. Now it's raising up Dante. This is a tide of feeling, emotion, and change. It's underway. And when he spoke in his victory speech, he did a not bad job of giving the entire speech in Spanish after he gave the speech in English. I didn't hear anybody complaining on Fox News. I think they were so startled, so frightened by this apparition of this happy white male middle-aged man who's been integrated in reverse into the black world, as opposed to the usual story where blacks have to integrate into the white world. But that's what's happening. He won by 30, 40 points. And it'll be immediately dismissed. Well, that's only New York. Yeah. When Bloomberg was mayor and Giuliani were mayor of New York, I didn't hear people on Fox News saying, well, that's odd because New York is so liberal. This is a real shift.